The moral of today's video will be garbage in is garbage out. If you want to know a little bit more and my take on it, stay tuned. Hello, I'm Tom. Welcome to my channel where we talk about continuous improvement in an industrial setting. And today I'd like to talk with you a bit about how the way that you collect your data, and especially the type of data that you use in your calculations and to feed your system, will really strongly influence your outcomes. And that is a logical thing. And I think, well, if you're watching this, you understand, right? That when you have bad data to start, you'll end up with bad results. But it is a lot more insidious, because many of the calculations that we do actually make it seem like we get a normal result. So pretty common mistakes in getting your data will lead to a number that people will trust, but that they should not trust, because it is not a good steering point of information. But before we dive into the video, I hope you will forgive me a short personal message. You see, up until recently, I was very proud that I learned Russian in Ukraine during my work and living there. And well, it's that has become a bit of a difficult position now to keep, but let's just say that I really hope that that situation comes out in a more or less okay way. And well, to my Russian-speaking audience, I would like to say, я очень надеюсь, что русский народ и российское правительство — это совершенно разные, оказывается, сейчас вещи, что русская культура намного более широкая, чем только то, что сейчас творится. And after that short sort of political message, let's continue to a different way of improving, and that is in data, in how we see things. Something that I see often in how we register stuff in a factory, in the office as well, and in a way that you cannot really check anymore what happened in the factory. And let me just get a couple of examples to get the ideas flowing, right? Because there are hundreds, thousands of examples and things how this might go wrong. But for instance, we have a product temperature that is super important for quality or processing standards. And we have a norm that we say, and it should be over 80 degrees. As we see, this was clearly over 80. So what do we now expect an operator who does this check to write down on the registration forms, or enter into a digital registration form? That is somewhere around 90-ish, right? I see a bit too often that when it is over 80 and you put in the thermometer, and just, no, it rises, it rises over 80, it hasn't stopped rising yet, and they will just write, okay, on the production form. While this, I mean, okay, you did the check that it is more than, but this is an okay value, not an 80 value. It shouldn't have been 80. So here, writing down the sort of demanded value is really damaging. Now, if they would write only specifically 80, at some point you will probably think, I don't believe it anymore, exactly 80. But what you then will also see is a sort of variation, 80, 82, something like that every time. And it almost asks you to believe that it was around 80-ish. Now, I have truly seen this in places where, in fact, there is also an upper temperature, where if it goes over 90, well, things start to, overheat and get negative effects on your product, and over 100 completely. So important stuff when you don't specifically check what is written down. Another thing that I've also seen from time to time is where you say, well, let's check if the product comes out nice and round in this example. And then at the startup of the line, it's sort of. This one, yeah, this one's good, this one's good. So what do we put on the product registration form? Yes, it is good. Now, if you do this purely at the startup of a process run, a product run, maybe okay. Maybe it's nice. I've also seen this in a sample that you take somewhere during production. At any time, you just pick a couple of samples from the line, you check them, it's not completely good, and let me just adjust the machine a little bit. Yeah, now it is good, and then you mark it good. While quality systems are generally made up in such a way that if you, for instance, have an hourly check, it was good an hour ago, it is good right now, you assume that the whole hour in between had good production. While if it was good an hour ago, then it dropped down tremendously and the operator had to adjust the line and really do something to get it back up to acceptable levels, you generally assume as a first step that that whole last hour is lost. You block it and you start checking on different intervals, shorter and shorter basically intervals, where did it go wrong. So you check at half an hour, you take a couple, if that was good you move it forward, if it was bad you move it backward, and you use this as a way to sample basically a whole period of time. But if at that second hour your operator picks up a couple of bad samples, corrects the machine until they get a good sample again, a good product, and then just mark it good, afterwards you will assume that everything was good. So you really lose data. But the most insidious part of this is, let's say that if the operator just needs to check every hour and they can correct the line when needed, they just use it to steer the process, but they don't write it down at all, then this is sort of part of the control loop of your process. As soon as the operator sees that there's something wrong, they will adjust, they'll make sure that the product is within range. And again, same with the temperature, when they see it's a bit too low or too high, they adjust something and that's okay. That's sort of a feedback loop. But when you start noting it down, registering it on paper or in your digital systems, almost every time this stuff is afterwards used for quality calculations, for seeing how standardized the production is, how well things are running, how stable our form or our temperature is actually in our production. Because as soon as it is written down on paper in, let's say, such a way, we assume that we have 4 hours of good production here, continuous good production. Here is basically the core message of this video. As soon as you have a checklist with all green checks, or actually as soon as you have any data entry sheet that you get your information from, always, without any exception, go also to the shop floor, go to Gemba and check what is actually happening. What are operators precisely measuring, when, how much, and make sure you see it go wrong at some point, right? And I don't mean the registration, I mean make sure that you see what happens when a product is not up to specs, or when you do not cross the needed border, or you go way over it. What is then registered and what happens in those non-standard situations? Because this, just looking at the form, will give you a very different impression. This is the impression of how it should be, what you would expect in an organization with a nice, stable quality system that is also really used in production. But that's not the situation in all of our factories. In fact, I dare to say that in maybe even all of the factories I've worked in, something like this is happening somewhere. Now there's widespread misusage of information, of data entry, and occasional stuff in a good factory, but it happens, it really does, and it can be, almost always is, because the operator or the quality technician, but they are not really fully aware of what and why exactly are they measuring it. And I also saw that it's almost always done with the best of intentions. So let's not start blaming anyone except perhaps ourselves as managers and CI specialists or quality specialists. It is our task, really our responsibility, to make sure that the people doing our production control, our data registration, also really know what they're checking for and what to do when things go wrong, and really explain why we're doing that. But in the end, we also get the trouble because this gives us wrong information. And you may think, well, but at some point it will give you information that you cannot fully use. That is a bit of a problem, but hey, we've had some unusable information before. Now, the problem is in this effect of this is not just unusable information, it is wrong information. And we get a lot of that when you do our statistical tools on it. Now, I know I've talked a bit about how to check for normality and is it needed? Yes, and we've also had some discussions on why it's maybe not too needed to know all the statistics and to check for normality the whole time, and do you really need to be on the nitty-gritty? Well, yes and no. The thing is, if you and let me just draw a distribution, right? A uniform distribution, basically each value that is possible is generated as much every time. A normal die, for instance, if you just roll 1 to 6, they'll come up. If you ask Excel to make a standard deviation out of this, it will. It will make something like that, very wide, a bit lower. It'll just do that because Excel does not check your data for you. It assumes that you already did that. It assumes that you first look at your data, first look at your process, then at your data, and then it just does a calculation. And the calculation says, well, the average is here, how much do we spread from the average? Oh, let's divide it. And it does all its statistical, mathematical magic in getting all the squares and then summing them up and taking the square root, and it will give you a number that if you plot that into a normal distribution, you get a curve. That's not a problem at all. The only huge problem with this is that we're not expecting values there and there at all. But if we are going to use, instead of a histogram, we're going to use standard deviation, just average and standard deviation to control our processes. And we're going to say, well, maybe we're going to even say we need to be 6 sigma, 6 standard deviations away from our norm. But a factory that still has these type of data collections probably will stay 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the norm. But a standard deviation here is huge. You're really going to mess up your own systems. This is not management information anymore. And that is why whenever you are doing any data analysis, one, you go to the floor, you check what is being measured and how, and do they actually use equipment that is more or less suitable to measure this system. And here, and I say more or less because we know, of course, there's also measuring systems analysis. We know R&R, repeatability, reproducibility, where we really check, are these scales really good enough to measure the difference in product that we expect here? But first off, go there and check if they're using scales that have a measuring sensitivity, a measuring unit that is more or less in the area of what you want, that the scales are normally placed and that they seem to be working, and that if there's any Tara that needs to be corrected, that they do it in a normal way. And that's before you get into all the nitty-gritty stuff about how you really have to handle and calibrate scales. And the same, of course, also it goes for things like thermometers and pH meters are also really difficult machines to keep normally. If you ever see especially a glass pH meter sitting somewhere completely dry, and it's probably been dry for a couple of hours, and then someone puts it into your product, you're not going to get a normal result to begin with. So those things you check, but those are, I would almost say, the standard things to check. So a good quality department will check that for you. What you also need to check is, what are they really measuring? So if we are measuring a temperature, are we measuring the ingredient going into our process? Or are we measuring during the process? Or are we measuring the ingredient coming out, or maybe coming out after a mixing step? Or do we measure a insulating wall side flow? So are we measuring with what temperature do we heat the stuff instead of the actual product? And all of these examples can be very valid measurements. I mean, I've known all of them and they're good, but you need to know which of them and what it tells you about your process. And then when you checked what is happening on the floor, when you really checked the process, saw with your own eyes what's happening, checked how it is registered, the next thing, draw it out. Really first use visual statistics, so to say. And so go for a histogram. Check for strange outliers in your data. Also check for probably missing elements. Is there an hour of continuous data simply missing? Or do you see strange things? And when you do this a couple of times and you get a little bit familiar with the type of data that you expect, you will start also recognizing it. And you might say, well, that is a bit of a subjective way to clean up my data. But really this sort of experience, like sort of a human sensor, it is very strong. When you build up a bit of experience on your processes and the type of data that should come out of it, I guarantee to you, you will become a very good data cleaner because you see strange patterns. And also when you see these things, you can even go to the QQ graphs where you really check how it is in the line. You can go to all kinds of sort of semi-descriptive statistics, but really a scatter plot, a histogram, and a time series, they do wonders. They usually do not give you the final answer that you're looking for, because very often you just need to draw one specific statistical number from it, like a CPK, or a standard deviation, or a minimum value, or maybe the 25th percent quartile. Stuff like that is often what you need as your management information. But before that, it is your duty to check by such visual means or by tests of normality, tests of distribution, that you can actually use the data. If you don't, you run a very big risk of getting garbage in, but then nicely polished and presented garbage out. And your management will steer on it, and you will adjust your processes on it. And then you are just going to steer your factory down the drain, and that will cost you pots and pots of money. So really go to that process, see for yourself, see the data and the visual statistics for yourself, and then use the descriptive statistics, then use all of our Six Sigma tools, which are really, really powerful if you have correct data input. And if you see that you do not have correct data input, go to training, go to really making it easy. And as a sort of a last tip also, very often making the registration simpler for the operator, for the person doing the registration, even though you know that maybe it's not the most optimal way to measure it, or not the most optimal way to obtain the data, but at least it's the same always, very consistent, and you can trust at least the number that comes out of it. That will give you a lot better management information. So there you have it. As I told right from the beginning, the moral of the story is garbage in, garbage out. But really, this is about garbage under the radar. Make sure that we get that out of our systems. Now, if you like this little reminder, don't forget to hit that like button. Also, tell me what type of problems do you run into? What would you like me to explain? I think actually one of the things I'm going to explain in one of my next videos is an easier registration system that I only recently learned of. A very nice alternative to the, let's say, the mean and standard deviation calculations, because you can do it absolutely without a calculator. So also you'll be getting that from me pretty soon. For now, I wish you the best of luck in your continuous improvement, in your data collection. And as always, remember to also enjoy the journey.